One morning, my brother came in very cross with the painter for having drawn the general's aides-de-camps holding their handkerchiefs in front of their mouths. I know better than anyone else what took place at Jaffa, he said, because I was there with the other aides-de-camp. We certainly did not feel comfortable, but would we have dared showed our nervousness on such an occasion when the general, in order to reassure the troops, displayed such courage and exposed himself as he did? I had considerable difficulty in proving to my brother that since painting was only an approximation of reality, a picture could only express an idea from a certain angle. In this case, in order to indicate the courage of the principal figure, the painter had been obliged to suggest a different feeling on the part of the others and sacrifice them in this respect. All the other aides-de-camp shared my brother's just indignation, and I had trouble pacifying them and making them accept the idea of artistic convention. The first consul was entirely absorbed by his work. He rested neither day nor night, and everything else was subordinated to it. Bedtime and mealtime were equally irregular, and he seemed able to do without sleep or food. He always lunched alone. We saw him only at dinner. If he happened to come downstairs earlier and my mother was still dressing, he enjoyed teasing her or criticizing the way she did her hair. He would take off the flowers she was wearing, put them back differently, insist that his new way was much more becoming than the way the hairdresser had arranged them, and call on me to testify what good taste he had. All this with a most comically serious manner. Days when he had something on his mind, he would come in looking serious, sit down in a big armchair in front of the fireplace, or walk about the room without paying attention to anyone. "Not ready yet?" would be his only remark. Dinner took place in silence. It lasted 10 minutes. Sometimes he even left the table before dessert had been served. My mother would point this out to him. He would smile, sit down a moment, and then leave us immediately without having said a word. When he was in a humor like this, everyone was afraid of him. No one ventured to interrupt his thoughts for fear of disturbing him and receiving a harsh rebuff. We would say to each other, "He's in a bad temper today. Has anything new happened?" After having tried to find out what the trouble might be, we would not know after all. We went to the theater fairly often. The plays the consul liked best were tragedies by Corneille and Racine. He only went to the opera because we enjoyed it. The day of the first performance of Dansomenie, my brother, who had told us he would not be dining at the Tuileries, appeared about 6 o'clock, accompanied by all the other aides-de-camp. I was surprised and told him so. He informed me that there was a plot to assassinate the first consul at the play that night, and that the latter intended to go in order to seize the conspirators red-handed. All measures had been taken to ensure my stepfather's safety, but as a further safeguard, his aides-de-camp were going with him. Eugène begged me not to say a word to anyone, especially not to our mother, whose alarm would interfere with the consul's plans. Imagine my terror up to the moment when, entering the opera, I saw everything was quite as usual. The conspirators had hired the box just over hours. They planned to assassinate the first consul, either when he came in or as he was going out. But they were arrested while the performance was going on. They were tried and convicted. They were Jacobins, called Srirachi, Arena, etc., and one of their accomplices had betrayed them shortly before the attempt was to be made. Another plot was made to kill the consul at the theater by shooting him with a sort of perfected pea shooter. I had heard of the plot, and during the entire performance, as I sat between my mother and the consul, I kept casting nervous glances all around the audience. Every time a man took out his handkerchief, I wondered if the fatal missile was not about to be aimed at our box. Yet one speedily becomes accustomed to every danger. The failure of several attempts of this kind gave us a feeling of perfect security. But this did not last. For some time, people had been talking about an oratorio by Haydn, the music of which was supposed to be remarkably fine. The day of the performance arrived, and we were preparing to go to the opera house where it was to be given. The consul, who had sat down after dinner by the fire, did not seem inclined to go out. We were all dressed and waited impatiently for him to make up his mind. My mother urged him to come. "It will amuse you. You are working too hard." The consul shut his eyes and made no reply. Finally, he said we could go, but he was staying in the house. My mother wanted to keep him company, and an argument ensued which ended by orders being given to have the carriages brought to the door. A moment before stepping into his carriage, the consul found fault with my mother's dress, and we owed our life to this remark. She wished to repeat it to Caroline and the aide-de-camp, and thus lost a few minutes. Consequently, our carriage, instead of being as usual, immediately behind that of the consul, was some little distance away. As we entered the Rue Saint-Nicaise, we felt a violent shock. The carriage seemed to be blown away. The glass in the window broke and fell on us. "It's an attempt to kill Bonaparte," exclaimed my mother, and fainted. Our horses, terrified at the noise, suffocated by the powder, reared, and taking the bits in their teeth, dashed back with us to the Tuileries. Caroline, although she was about to have a child, remained cool and attempted to reassure my mother. She had seen a massive flame. A house had fallen down. It could not be a plot against her brother, but my mother kept repeating over and over, "It's an attempt to kill Bonaparte." I tried to calm her to the best of my ability. I explained to her that it was our carriage that had been attacked, that the violence of the shock we'd experienced proved this, and that the mistake had saved the consul. A piece of glass had slightly wounded my hand. Rapp had dashed into the Rue Saint-Nicaise. There he caught sight of men, women, and children wounded or dying, or with shattered limbs and ruins that threatened to crash down upon him. But the cries of the victims did not check his course. He sought to rejoin the consul, and yet feared to find him. One of the soldiers of the escort, who had been sent to meet us, relieved our apprehension with the news that the explosion had only occurred as the consul was leaving the Rue Saint-Nicaise, and that he had arrived safely at the opera. We proceeded thither by another route. My mother was unable to dissemble her emotion when she caught sight of her husband, but he, calm and untroubled, sought to quiet her fears. "What is the matter?" he asked. "What has happened?" "Nothing very serious." His whole manner was as placid as though he did not know there had been another attempt made on his life. Rapp arrived and described the horrors of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, through which he had just passed. The prefect of the police and General Junot, military governor of Paris, presented their reports as they secured further details of this terrible episode. The consul listened in silence, but when he heard the number of persons whose bodies had been found near the cart loaded with powder, which had served as an infernal machine, he exclaimed in tones of anguish, "How ghastly it is to cause death of so many people, in seeking to do away with a single man." The news of what had taken place began to spread through the audience. Alarm and curiosity had already caused a number of the spectators to leave the theater, and my mother's agitated appearance indicated clearly that something extraordinary had happened. Finally, the performance was over, and we returned to the Tuileries. There we found assembled all the government authorities and leading citizens of Paris. I listened to their discussion. Each suggested which hostile political party he believed capable of committing such an outrage. The consul and the ministers of state accused the Jacobins. Fouché was alone in his belief that the blow had been struck by the royalists, but failed to convince his hearers. Indeed, how could one suspect that men who had so loudly protested against the use of violence could be guilty of such an act? Were they trying to resemble those upon whom they showered scorn and reproaches? A little later, the consul's coachman, who was drunk that night, came in while we were at dinner and gave the following details. One of his friends had rented a stable to some unknown man. They kept a cart there, which they came often to look at. The day of the explosion took place, they had taken away the cart and never reappeared. While drinking at a public house, he had secured this information, which, when added to what the Minister of Police secured, furnished the necessary clues. There was no possibility of doubting that it was the royalists who had hatched and executed this plot. I did not enjoy in the least the life I led at the Tuileries. I should have preferred to live in the country. Malmaison was a charming spot, and I was delighted when we went there for a few days, although even then I could not enjoy it in the same way I did when I was alone there. On such occasions, I was able to take long walks through the park, but at other times, when the house was filled with men, these strolls would not have been proper. I was well aware of the fact, and here again the good advice I had received from Madame Campan, which always meant so much to me, taught me what to avoid. The consul's habits were much the same at Malmaison as in Paris. He invariably worked all the morning alone with his ministers. Scientists were invited to dinner. They stayed afterwards, spending the rest of the evening, and the consul enjoyed their conversation. There I saw the most frequently were Monge, Bertholet, Fourcroy, Volney, Laplace, Lagrange, and Perny. Those who were married came with their wives. Le Mercier also came to Malmaison several times and read us his tragedies. Of them all, the emperor seemed to prefer Monge best as a man, and he never broke off relations with him entirely. He even suggested later on that I have him as a tutor for my children. Volney came to see us only during the consulate, but then he came less often. He was highly esteemed by all the persons who had taken part in the expedition to Egypt. They considered that his account of his travels in that country was the only accurate one, and that the descriptions given by another author called Savary were not true. Volney was a rigid believer in Republican ideals. He always came and sat next to me at the table and asked me questions about Saint-Germain, enjoyed hearing me give my views upon life, and seemed to approve of them. In those days, I did not realize how eminent these distinguished men were. My only recollections of them were very trivial conversations and remarks such as youth could readily understand. For instance, the thing I remember about Volney is that whenever he sat beside me, he would insist on my not eating too much bread. He said it was not nourishing, and it made the child too thick. I believe it was the word child, which I had never heard pronounced before, that made me remember the distinguished scientist. I learned later that his fidelity to republicanism caused him to see less of us during the empire. The emperor never resented this. He respected all opinions as long as they were honest and sincere, and I recall having seen him very much upset in 1812 or 1813 on hearing of an accident that happened to Volney. The scientist had been walking along quietly when a bull suddenly charged him and tossed him some distance into a field. I also saw the emperor distressed by the news that Monsieur de Lafayette, who, like Volney, avoided us, had broken his leg on the ice as he was coming out from a ball. The consul was always anxious to meet and surround himself with eminent men of all kinds. I have never understood why people said he was jealous of others. On the contrary, I always felt that he sought to honor in every respect those whose achievements added to the glory of France. The only thing he would not consent to share was his political authority. He considered that this was indispensable to ensure the success of his vast plans and the best interests of his country. Therefore, he would not share it or allow it to be weakened. Moreover, the enthusiasm of the crowd, the esteem and consideration shown him by everyone he encountered proved his superiority. He seemed born to command other men. I have always seen him the same, as general, consul, and emperor. His generals never spoke to him familiarly. Neither Lannes, Berthier, Augereau, nor Lefebvre ever sat down in his presence. He impressed them even more than he did others with a sense of his personal preeminence, of which they were all conscious. A difference in rank has always been considered respectfully in France. I have seen Lannes, Bessières, Murat furiously angry, jealous of each other, and talking of leaving the consul's service because, according to them, he had treated them unfairly in the way of promotion. Frequently, I managed to reconcile them. But whether or not I did so, the moment General Bonaparte appeared, no one said another word. Sometimes they would have a sullen air if their pride had been too deeply wounded. The general, always aware of what was going on, guessed their thoughts, and by an abrupt phrase or a gentle pull of the ear made the insurgent as meek as he had just been the contrary. Scientists seemed more at their ease with the consul, for he always allowed them to speak their minds freely, but they remained standing in front of him, following his remarks with avidity and a sort of admiration. I am sure that the authority the emperor wielded was due to the fact that all those who spoke to him felt he was superior to anyone else in his intelligence, and that since it is necessary to have a ruler, no one was better qualified than he. The consul had so great a respect for all forms of learning that if a distinguished man did not come to see him, he would find time, in spite of his many duties, to visit the scholar. One day, he went out for a drive with my mother and myself. We went to the Jardin des Plantes to call on Daubenton, the naturalist, who lived in a little pavilion giving on the garden. He seemed very, very old, as he sat in a large armchair, but in despite of his advanced years, spoke with great animation. The general asked him many questions about Buffon. I have always been sorry I did not keep a letter the general received from Beaumarchais after his return from Italy. I might have done so easily enough. The letter was so flattering and so well written that he read it aloud to my mother and me, At that time, he was receiving so much praise, including expressions of such a fulsome variety, that I could not help noticing what was said with wit and moderation. The compliments Beaumarchais paid him struck me as being in the best of taste, but that letter, like so many others, was burned. In the days of the Republic, when polite social life was completely destroyed, the Republicans wished to have the upper classes adopt the manners and habits of the mob. Under the consulate, on the other hand, the consul, in bringing the different strata of society together, sought to introduce into what had formerly been exclusive circles people of worth and distinction, without regard for their origin. So deeply are aristocratic traditions rooted in France among all classes that the enterprise was far from easy. Nevertheless, he attempted it. He went so far as to invite to dinner at Malmaison some famous actors. I saw there one after another: Talma, Mademoiselle Raucourt, Mademoiselle Contat, Mademoiselle Fleury, all distinguished artists and possessing excellent manners. But people took offense, and so strong is the force of prejudice, it was quite as much the newly enriched commoners who objected as the old nobility. On the other hand, one day at the Tuileries, the consul invited to his table 2 old soldiers, one of whom was over 100 years of age. I remember it was dinner attended by the members of the first mission from Russia. One of the young princes attached to the mission, who sat beside me, told me that on their way through Germany, everyone tried to frighten them by speaking of their foolhardiness in venturing into France, where massacres took place all the time. Although he had not believed these tales, he was surprised to find out on arriving that all one heard talked about here were balls and receptions. One day, an old woman called a Malmaison, who seemed to be 100 years old. She was dressed in the fashion of the days of Louis XVI, with a little black tulle bonnet shaped like a raven's bill, semi-hoop skirts, and a brocaded gown set off with pockets. Only the stage had kept such costumes for those who played the parts of old women, and no one would ever have suspected that the person dressed in this fashion was the beautiful and famous actress Mademoiselle Clairon, who had once enchanted all of France. It was she who was the first to discard the habit of wearing dresses that were merely fashionable in favor of those suitable for the different heroines she portrayed. "I wished to see a hero before I died," she said to my mother, "and I thought, madame, you would not refuse me this pleasure." Indeed, my mother was very kind to her and invited her to spend part of the day at Malmaison while waiting for the consul to appear. When he did arrive, she looked at him attentively, and if by accident anyone interfered with her view of the first consul in the drawing room, she would request the person not conceal him from her during the few moments she had an opportunity of seeing him. The consul was most gracious to her, and among other things said, "I have heard so much about your admirable talent. I greatly regret never having witnessed one of your performances." "And I," she replied promptly, "am delighted you never did." Everyone was astonished, and she went on, "Had you done so, you would now be an old man. First consul, and France needs you to remain young." Mademoiselle Clairon died some time after this visit, having received from the consul the assistance she badly needed. Sometimes in the evening, when the consul had invited no one to Malmaison, he would send for a new book and ask me to read aloud. I was so embarrassed by the idea of doing so in front of him and all his staff that I could not tell one word from another. Then he would say, "Didn't Madame Campan teach you to read?" A remark which redoubled my embarrassment. One day he brought out Attila, which had just appeared. I remember it as being a very difficult ordeal. The names of trees, places, and animals which abounded in this volume were new to me, and I mispronounced them as though I was doing it on purpose. It was a great trial. If I had only dared, I should have pronounced them haphazard and no one would have noticed it, but I stopped each time and seemed to be spelling them out. I was so evidently ill at ease that after a few pages the consul stopped me and never again tried to make me read romantic literature.